Welcome to mini lecture number 5 in 7503 NSC Aviation Economics. The previous lecture we looked at the actual costs that drive airlines, and we've also looked in earlier lectures about the service price offer. What we're going to be taking a look in this lecture is airline pricing, revenue demand and output determinations. And of course these are all part of what we need to run an airline. Whilst they look very similar to what we've spoken about, they are slightly different and taking us one step in advance of what we've studied earlier. What we're going to be doing in this one is explaining the airline pricing process, and we're going to do it first of all taking a look at the regulated versus the liberalised pricing. We're going to be taking a look at theoretical pricing strategies and price discrimination and product differentiation. That is, what makes your seat on board your aeroplane different from your competitors. We're going to be describing the airline differential pricing in terms of market segmentation, fare product restrictions, traditional airline fare structures, and recent trends in airline pricing. That is, we're going to be taking a look, for example, when you fly on board an aircraft and you're sitting in your seat in economy, you think everyone else who's sitting in economy's paid the same price for their seat. But they haven't. Some have paid a cheaper price than you, some might have paid more than you. And we'll be seeing as to why the airlines actually do this. We'll be describing how airline revenue management process and how it's used basically in conjunction with a computer revenue management system. That is, airlines have a computer reservation system, and that feeds into a much bigger system. And we're going to be looking into what that much bigger system is and how the functions work. And we're going to be taking a look finally at flight overbooking and approaches. A lot of people, when they buy a ticket, and even when they have the piece of paper in their hand that says, I have a ticket, doesn't mean you've got a seat. And we'll find out what the airlines actually do in terms of flight overbooking. Because again, the fickle passenger sometimes doesn't turn up on time. And so how do the airlines cope with the fact that that could be an empty seat? An aircraft that taxis out with an empty seat is a seat whose earning power is lost forever. First of all, we'll be taking a look at some definitions, and we'll be taking a look at pricing itself and how that determines the different products and the different levels in the origin destination market. We'll be looking at revenue management, the process of determining the number of seats available for each fare level. And this goes back to what we were saying. In economy, you might have 6 different levels of economy where people pay different amounts. And we'll be taking a look at the fact that this system itself creates a range of fare quotes that can be given. And for example, you may have found this yourself, that if you book a month before a flight, you might find that your ticket is very, very cheap. Whereas if you book just 2 days before a flight, suddenly that same seat, an economy seat, is costing a lot more. And we'll find out why. So we'll be looking at cost and revenue factors in airline operations. Profit is the major driver. Without profit, airlines don't make the money to get new aircraft and to also pay for those unexpected things that crop up from time to time. Profit is the driver. And as we said in the earlier lecture, we looked at the direct operating costs that we need to pay to provide a seat on board an aircraft. We have a look at the other indirect operating costs, and these could be the actual the amortization of the actual aircraft itself. It's going to be decreasing in value. And we're going to be looking at other non-operating costs and revenues. For example, airlines may invest part of what they're taking in terms of government taxes. They may invest that part of the way before they actually pay those taxes. And then we'll be looking at some of those important metrics that decide as to whether you make a profit. Load factor, the weight load factor for freight, passenger yield, cargo yield, and traffic composition. Because we know that airlines not only carry passengers, they carry cargo on board. As we'll learn in a later lecture, they carry a lot more cargo on a normal passenger flight than most people really realise. And so that tells us what our costs are and what our revenues are. And we said the difference between costs and revenues is our profit. We'll be looking at the regulated versus the liberalised pricing market. And of course, the one thing that we know is in 1979, global deregulation started in the United States and it's spread across the world. And whilst deregulation has made it tough for airlines, it's made it good for passengers. And very often, even though the price of oil has really skyrocketed, at the moment, it's in a bit of a lull, but it'll start going up again in the future. But despite all those changes, airline seats are cheaper than they've ever been before, and people who once would have never thought of flying are flying. So deregulation has made a big difference. And of course, the thing is that airlines very often are selling fares where the margin is so small that they really have to stay on top of those costs, as we've looked at. And of course, what they make sure of is, well, we only give those low fare seats on the routes that we know are going to be very high density. That is, there's a lot of turnover. So even though the profit's small, we're selling lots of seats, and so that adds up. We'll be taking a look at theoretical pricing strategies, and we'll look at the three different types. Cost-based pricing, that is self-explanatory. Demand-based pricing, that is, what's the demand? And then the final one, service-based pricing, that is, what sort of service are we providing? And we've covered that in previous lectures. And of course, what we find out is that airlines use a mixture of these three. And what they're trying to do is to make sure that they're covering every angle so that they're keeping their costs low. They're also making sure that when the demand is low, that they've got special offers to attract people to fly who perhaps didn't plan to fly, but at the same time they're trying to make their service that little bit extra from what other airlines are doing. And so the one thing that we see is that airlines make sure that they use price-based costing, first of all, to reduce their overall costs itself. They also want to match the low-cost carrier competitors, and also them trying to make sure they meet the passengers' expectations of low prices. So from time to time we'll watch the television, we'll go online, and we'll see that airlines have got a particular offer going to a holiday destination, and we say that is cheaper than I've ever seen it before. But there's always a reason behind it, and that is demand might have dropped off. It might not be the full holiday season. So they're saying, okay, we've got to get people to fly because we have to provide a service to that destination. So what can we do to attract people to fly who weren't planning to fly? We'll also take a look at the factors impacting demand. And of course, we looked at this in a previous lecture. Passenger preferences, number of passengers, their financial status and income. That is, the more disposable income they've got, then it's great. They'll spend it on flying. Whereas when times are hard and their disposable income's down, they're not going to fly. What are the competitors doing? And also, what do passengers expect? That is, if they can see the competitors' prices are low, they'll expect yours to be low. So we get the differential pricing. That is, airlines actually trade off between the price that they're offering and the inconvenience. For example, we said in a previous mini lecture, you get that special low-cost seat, but why is it low cost? Because if you miss your flight, you're going to have to buy another seat. That is, they won't put you on a later flight, as you might have expected buying a more expensive ticket with a legacy airline. So the more inconvenience people can put up with, then the cheaper we are able to offer them a seat. And so we come up against this concept of willingness to pay, and airlines use this fully the whole way. And we'll find out all the different ways that airlines exploit this willingness to pay to offer those really cheap seats. We'll look at the differential pricing model, and we'll take a look at the graph that we show here. And we say in a perfect world, every seat on board the aircraft should be at a different price. That is, if we take a look at when all the seats become available, perhaps 30 days before the flight is due to operate, we might say, okay, the first seat we'll give at the cheapest fare possible. Once that's sold, the next seat goes up in price. So in a perfect world, every seat would cost a different price until finally the last seat goes at the highest price. Well, in that sort of world, what we find is that's a perfect world, but airlines try to break it down into classes. That is, within economy, there are different classes of seat within economy depending on when you bought that seat. So this is one of the things. So reading this graph in your own time, what you can see is it's telling us that in a perfect world, every seat should be at a different price, but airlines try to make sure that they do put different prices on different batches of seats. The question is, how do they actually decide how many seats will be offered at the cheapest price, then how many seats at the next price? And we'll be looking in the course at how that can actually be calculated and what the effect is, so that we virtually exploit that price difference to the maximum that we can. If we take a traditional approach to our seats, we find, okay, the more restrictions that we put on, the cheaper it would be expected. For example, we read at the moment about the fact that the airlines are saying they're going to drop their baggage, their free baggage entitlement from 10 kilograms carried on board in Australia to 7 kilograms. Is this going to affect people travelling? That is, if people say, well, if I can't travel and take on all the baggage that I need for my flight, I don't want to pay the extra $50 or more to put baggage in the hole, will I decide not to travel? Or will I travel on a bus? Or will I in fact decide that I'm going to spend my money instead going on a cruise? These are all the things. So airlines have to work out how much do we actually get to the stage where passengers say it's a real inconvenience and I'm not going to put up with that. So this perfect segmentation we'll be studying is impossible, but airlines try to exploit. And so they have all these restrictions. We'll be seeing as to how they actually go about applying these and how they work. Advanced purchase requirements. And we know ourselves that generally works. A one-way versus a round trip. Whether the cheap fare requires us to stay a certain number of days before we return. So the airline gets a cut of the hotel that you've had to book as part of the ticket. The fare penalties. For example, if you don't travel at the time you want, then there may be a penalty or you buy another ticket. Certain directions command a higher price than other directions because there are more people travelling at that time. Peak versus off-peak. And the different seasonal adjustments that we might make. We find in airline management, we take an approach of differential pricing versus yield management. And we'll be really taking a look at what these mean. And we know that yield management is a way of protecting a certain number of seats for the people who are going to pay the high price. That is, the people who book last, generally business passengers, so we get the maximum use out of those seats. And for example, we know business passengers always pay more, and therefore they are a big part of the airline's profit maximisation. So again, what the airlines are trying to do is to make sure that they get a balance between the load factor, that is, filling the maximum number of seats that are available, versus the yield, and that is the number that the revenue is divided by the revenue passenger kilometres. And we'll be seeing how these formulas work. We'll be looking at a typical third generation revenue management system, and we'll be seeing as to the sorts of things that need to be in the database. The revenue data, historical bookings, no-show, passengers who don't turn up, the actual bookings were coming in, forecasting that we studied in a previous lecture, the forecasting models and how they crunch the data to give us information, and they tell us about the way in which we will sell a certain number of seats, and also as to how much we'll overbook. That is, we will sell perhaps, will it be 120% of the seat capacity based on the fact that 20% of people won't turn up, so we still get a full aircraft, and how this works in with our reservations and inventory system. Overbooking is a fact of life. People who've come up against overbooking don't like this concept, but it's a part of airline life because some people just don't turn up for all sorts of reasons. And so we'll be looking at the different terms: physical capacity, authorised capacity, confirmed bookings, no-show rate. We'll be combining those into formulas where we will actually look and see as to how airlines work out how much are we going to overbook this flight by. And the big thing is trying to predict that is difficult, because if in fact more people turn up than you predicted, you have a problem as an airline. It's not good for your reputation. What are you going to do to preserve that reputation? So in terms of what we've covered in this lecture, we can now relate to the way in which the industry's changed with the liberalised pricing. We look at theoretical pricing strategies and price discrimination, product differentiation. What makes you different? We'll be describing airline differential pricing in terms of market segmentation, the fare product restrictions, that is, that cheap fare, it's got a few restrictions that make it a cheap fare, traditional airline fare structures and the trends in airline pricing. And we'll be looking at the revenue management systems, all the different parts of data and forecasting that go into that to interact with our computer reservation systems to make sure we're optimising the use of our assets all the time to make that profit that's going to keep us ahead of the game. Thank you.